Hi, I'm Sujata Massey, the author of Widows of Malabar Hill, and you're watching Solved on the Author's Voice.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. This is Solved, and I'm your host, Libby Hellmann, the author of 15 compulsively readable thrillers. And I am delighted today to have with us Sujata Massey, who is the author of a brand new series called, the book is called The Widows of Malabar Hill. It's published by Soho Crime. The hardcover is $26.95, and we want to thank Soho for allowing Sujata to get to Chicago and talk to us, which brings us to the woman herself. Welcome, Sujata.
Hey, Libby, nice to see you.
It's nice to see you, too. It always is. By the way, if you're watching this live, whether it's on authorsvoices.net or Facebook Live, please use the button below the player to submit a question to Sujata. Include your name and where you're from. More importantly, we hope you're going to want to order a signed book right here, right now. All you have to do is click the button below, and Sujata will sign it right after we're finished talking in the studio specifically for you. Okay, I think I've done my housekeeping. Welcome again.
Oh, it's so great to be here on this rainy January day in Chicago.
Yes, but it's not as cold as it was. So.
Yeah, that's what I hear.
Well, by the way, we broadcast from Chicago, the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, just in case you want to know. So you are known for your Ray Shimura mysteries, which are set mostly in Japan, but now you've taken a new tack with a new series that explores India in the 1920s. How did that happen?
Well, it happened over a number of years. I have written, Ray Shimura books starting in the 1990s, and then in the mid-2000s, maybe around 2006, I decided to try and write something different. So I started work on a standalone set in India that was a historical, and I really wanted to write something set in the past because I found that in my Ray mysteries, I was really interested in older stories, and those kinds of stories kept weaving themselves into the modern mysteries. So I thought, why not just set something in the past, and that way I can really explore what life was like for women, especially at that time.
So that became the Sleeping Dictionary.
Yeah,
right?
that book was the Sleeping Dictionary. Thank you.
I love that book, and after you've read Widows of Malabar Hill, you have to go back and get Sleeping Dictionary. It was really good. I just read it like I inhaled it.
Thanks. So. It's not a mystery, but I call it like a novel of suspense, and it's about a young Bengali woman in 1930s India who becomes involved in the freedom movement.
Mm-hmm. I remember when it came out. So then once you had written the Sleeping Dictionary, and then you wrote a couple of stories or novellas, how did this series come to you?
Well, kind of in a roundabout way, like the things that were great about writing that historical novel where I loved the research and I loved the milieu and I loved telling the story. But what was not great was I was missing the people from my mystery world. Like a lot of my mystery readers didn't necessarily want to come over and read that other book. And I have really enjoyed being a mystery writer and having this routine of, every year going around the country and stopping in to see booksellers who are like my friends and hearing from the same kind of people over and over again. And I thought, could I find a way to bring these two worlds that I enjoy together, the world of mystery and the world of historical fiction? So it happened that my agent met with Juliet Grames, who's the crime editor at Soho, and they encouraged me to submit a proposal. So I did, and here I am a couple years later with a book out.
Yes, and I read it, and it's wonderful. And it's a place that I've never been to, and it's set in the 1920s. So I also, as you know, write historicals. So to me, that was right away. I couldn't wait to get into it. Can you kind of describe what India, or at least what Mumbai, was like in the 1920s? And if you want, we can go to some of the maps.
Yeah, sure. Well, in those days, Mumbai was Bombay.
Right.
So my book is a mystery of 1920s Bombay. And it had started out, as a kind of the swampy area, a collection of islands. And then the Portuguese had first inhabited it and they called it Bomba. And then it was seized by Indian royals, took over and kicked the Portuguese out. And then ultimately the British came, the East India Company came and battled for it and took possession of that land in the 1600s. And they knew that they had dreams. They wanted to build up something as successful as their other big port, Calcutta. And they needed labor. So one of the things they did is they went to Gujarat, where there were a lot of these Parsi settlers. And Parsis are Zoroastrians who emigrated from Persia. And they were expert boat makers and very good at building buildings. And so they invited them to come to Bombay and build Bombay. And my character is a young woman who's a descendant of one of these building families. And in fact, her last name is Mystery, and that means builder.
Oh, really? Okay. I thought it was just a
Yeah.
convenience, mystery.
Yeah, well, this is funny. A lot of the Parsis, they didn't really have last names, and the British wanted them to have last names. So they just took on last names like, boat builder or soda wala, or, which is another name in my book. The wala means to do something. And so they took on last names that related to their professions.
Very, very similar to Europeans who needed last names in the 12th, 13th, and 14th century. So they got last names like Fischer and things like that. Interesting that you went back to mysteries. I'm just going to say one thing about when I wrote A Bitter Veil, which, as you know, is about...
I love that. Beautiful book set in Iran.
When I wrote that, more than one person said to me, why'd you need the mystery? It would have been a great book, even if you didn't have the mystery. Why did you feel the need to put in a mystery? And so I'm going to ask you, with all due respect, because I loved it and I loved the mystery too, why did you decide to put a mystery in the story?
Yeah, well, I was excited at the opportunity because my heroine is a lawyer. She's the first woman lawyer in that city. And historically speaking, there was an earlier woman lawyer, but she didn't practice in Bombay. And this character,
like a solicitor, and her father was the barrister. Is that?
Well, that's my
right?
character
Yeah,
is a
right.
solicitor.
Right.
So the fact that she is a lawyer brings her into all these incredible situations where there are disputes over inheritance, where there are problems in marriages, where there could be theft. It goes on and on and on. But lawyers really do come close to, criminal situations. So I thought it was perfect. It was the perfect way to have a mystery story, but also really teach you a lot about the history of the country and also how women's rights have changed over the decades.
Yes, let's talk a little bit about that, because the women that she ends up investigating and defending at the same time were subjected to purdah. Tell us about purdah and what happened to it. I know it doesn't exist anymore.
Well, I think in rural areas there still are people living in purdah, but purdah literally means behind the curtain. And it was a way that men protected women in their family from the threat of, other men coming near them and violating them in some way, even if it was by a glance. So this was practiced in it's more likely to be practiced in a well-off household in the past. And so it happened in Muslim households. It also happened with Hindu royalty, which is something I'm going to write about in another book. And so if you were living in a Purta household, that usually meant that one section of the house was for women and children only, and there might be these beautiful screens, marble screens with fretwork that you could look through, and that way the women could see what was going on in other parts of the house, and they'd know who was arriving, but nobody would see them.
And they were totally isolated from the other parts of the house. What about
Yeah.
going out and going shopping or
Well,
doing what they needed?
there was such a thing as a Purta car, which had curtains so that you couldn't look out or look in. And if to get to the car, you'd have to have somebody standing with a shield in front of you, a shield or a blanket.
When did that custom start to go out of?
I think that after independence is when you started to see
Really? It lasted
yeah.
that late?
Yeah, but not everybody. Like in some royal households, the younger generation would not be in Purta, but the older women were. And recently, I traveled and visited an old palace in Rajasthan, and when I was there, I visited the Purta quarters, and nobody was living there anymore because it was now a museum. But I was informed that there was a lady who lived into the 1970s who chose to maintain Purta, the grandmother of that royal family.
Okay.
Because that was all she had known.
When you talk, okay, I'll come back to that. Sub-Inspector, how do you pronounce his name? There was a character, Singh.
Is he a Singh? I'm trying to even remember who that was.
Sub-Inspector Singh.
Singh, okay.
Singh. For police procedural fans, he would be analogous to what? A sub-inspector would be like a...
He would be like a junior investigator, like not the most important detective.
Yeah. He was one of the few Indians, correct, on the police force?
Yeah, it took a while for Indians to get jobs, to be given jobs that were not just being a constable. Like they were very happy to have people on the street as policemen, but they didn't really want to have them making decisions. And in a lot of colonial environments, like an Indian policeman couldn't arrest a white man, for example.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking to Anna Marie Alfieri, who writes a wonderful colonial series set in the part of Africa that was later to become Kenya. So that was a situation there.
So tell us a little bit about Praveen. She went to Oxford. Well, she grew up in Bombay, and then she went to Oxford. She got married, and then she went to Oxford, and then
She came back.
She came back.
And she came back, and she was no longer with her husband, but she sort of, occupies this really weird purgatory. She cannot get divorced because of the marriage laws at the time. And a lot of people, could not get divorced at all based on their religion. If you're a Hindu, you could not get divorced at all. If you were a Zoroastrian, you could get divorced only if the violence that your husband had committed was so extreme. For example, you'd lost an eye or you'd lost a limb. Those were acceptable. But, if I were to just slap you in the face, Libby, we couldn't get a divorce. Or curse you out, I couldn't do that.
And things have changed.
Hey,
How?
Guess who had a better situation with divorce? The Muslims.
Really?
Yes, they did, because it was built into the Islamic law that women could get a divorce from men. Men could get it. I'm not saying that everybody was running around doing it, but it was on the books that you could do it. And and they also gave dowries to women. When women married men, the women got a gift. In Hinduism, when a woman marries a man, the man's family gets a gift. Yes, so
interesting.
yeah, and so that plays into the story quite a bit. Like Praveen analyzes what these women got because she's working with a household where 3 women are married to the same man, and they all have different kinds of wedding gifts.
Yeah. And then what happened? What's the murder?
I don't know if we want to tell too
yeah,
much.
it might be a spoiler. Okay,
Yeah,
okay, but there is a murder.
There is a murder.
Yeah.
There is a murder, and she has her thoughts about who might have done it, but she also doesn't want to put anybody into jeopardy, because
She's very protective of the women.
Yeah.
And their children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, she understands what it is to be subjugated and to be exploited, and she doesn't want that to happen to anyone else if she can help it.
She is very, yes, she is a free-thinking, liberated woman, but she's also very accepting of the culture that she has come back to. I imagine that, I don't know, will you tell me, was it a shock for her to come back from Oxford after having so much freedom to be who she wanted to be, back into the semi-enclosed society of Bombay?
Well, I think that, Perveen, this character, works at her father's law firm. She gets to go into the city every day, and she knows he's the only man, there's the only law firm in India that would employ her, is her father's. So she doesn't want to bring shame onto to that. So, which is like a very typical, I think, Asian feeling for a child, is that you're not going to bring shame onto your family, and you want to have a harmonious relationship. So when her father says something to her like, no, you can't go to that house tomorrow, I'm worried about you going to that house, she'll say, all right. But she will not go. But she will think about a way to convince her father that she can go. Okay. And she has this great friend. The other thing that's interesting is she's got this friend, Alice Hobson Jones, who's British. Right. And normally the British in colonial fiction are absolutely horrible. But Alice is her friend from Oxford, and she's been involved in feminism. She doesn't exactly want to get married. I won't get into everything about Alice, but Perveen finds a way to bring Alice into the investigation because she knows that Alice could help her. And it helps Alice too. It gives Alice something to do, to get away from her
I'm
uptight mother.
This is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, professional and otherwise. Yeah, you clearly had to do a lot of research.
That's the fun part.
Yeah, yeah. Give us an overview of the kind of research that you did. And then I saw on your schedule, by the way, that you're actually going to India for a couple of book signings. That freaked me out. I mean, that freaked me out in a really good way. Yes. I want to find out how that happened.
Okay, all right. So the kind of research I do is I love to read old Indian newspapers because that really gives me a feeling for just the day-to-day. How did people get around places? What were they putting on their bodies? What were they watching in the cinema? All those kinds of things. So I'm either in India at an archive looking at newspapers, or I've gotten to a really great university that has access to old newspapers, or I'm at the Library of Congress. Another thing that was a really big deal for this book was for me to meet Parsi people, because I really only know one Parsi person in the United States. And Bombay is where most of them are. There are only 50,000 left in India. So I was able to chat.
Probably fewer in Iran.
And I went through a lot of questioning about marriage rituals. I talk about menstrual seclusion, that women in Orthodox households might have been away from the family for a whole week.
There's a few chapters where you draw that out, and it's pretty brutal.
Yeah, it's not going on today. I want to make sure everybody knows that. But there were Orthodox families that were doing it into the 20th century, and Perveen comes from this very progressive family that doesn't do that, and she falls in love with somebody whose parents are more traditional.
Right. Which gets us into the relationship with her husband, but we can leave that. So tell me a little bit more about the research.
Okay, so I said I'd love to go to India for that.
The newspapers, you were saying. Isn't there, I think I read that at the University of Minnesota, or someplace in Minneapolis.
There's a super great library at the University of Minnesota called the Ames Library of South Asia, which is probably the largest collection of material on India or on the subcontinent. But I'm remembering that what was very important for me is there was a brilliant book published about the history of law in India during colonial times. And its author, this legal historian, Dr. Mitra Sharafi, is at the University of Wisconsin.
Oh.
And so after I read her book, I wrote to her, and she was kind enough to read my manuscript.
Oh, that's lovely.
So every courtroom scene was vetted by this expert who has just written so much about it. So that was a really important key for me because I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, that's excellent. So you had the legal side of Perveen's life, you had the family side, her friends. Let's talk a little bit about the man that she ended up marrying without too many spoilers.
Okay. Cyrus Sodawala is a very attractive, dashing young Parsi, and his last name, Sodawala, relates to his family being in the soda bottling business.
Oh, really?
Which was a very Parsi occupation.
Okay.
And in fact, if you go to India, you've got to have a raspberry soda in Mumbai because that is the drink. That's the drink they invented, and it's absolutely delicious.
Okay.
So, he comes from this family, but they're also Parsi. So on the outside, it looks like it's going to be great. But his family came a little bit later. They were in this, second wave of immigrants that came in the 19th century. So they're a little bit more kind of pulling themselves up and I guess nouveau riche, I would say, whereas she kind of comes from an old money background. So there are some cultural clashes with that. Another thing that happened, and this probably is with a lot of different national groups, is these Parsis, Cyrus's family lives in a different area. They live in Calcutta. There are not as many other Parsis around. And so historically what happened is Parsis that weren't living in Bombay tended to be more conservative. So you would have more issues like maybe this menstrual seclusion or, other kinds of traditions.
Right. Okay. So so we'll leave it at it became a stormy relationship. Is that accurate to say? Okay.
Hot and stormy.
Hot and stormy. We have a couple questions here. So let's go to those. And again, if you'd like to write in a question, just type it in underneath the little screen on authors.net or type it in the comments if you're on Facebook Live. We'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
This is from Beth. I'm not sure where Beth is located, but she says, cannot wait to read Sujata's latest mystery. I hope you will invite Libby to join the fun at Malice Domestic in April.
Join the fun. Come join the fun. Malice Domestic is a wonderful mystery convention.
Yeah, I haven't been there in a few years, but I would consider going. I mean, it's in D.C.
Yeah, that's your old stomping ground.
Okay. Anyway, let's get to our question. Question is, why do you write? Okay. Why do you write the easiest to understand books about Asia for American readers? I mean this question very respectfully for writers from other cultures. Other Asian writers have different styles that we are used to reading Sujata.
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. Well, first of all, there's a lot of Indian fiction out because many Indian writers, English is their first language.
Right.
So I think that some of those novels, they're written for an Indian audience. Yes, they're written in English, but they're written for an audience, so there isn't a feeling of needing to explain. But I came up from a world where, first I was interpreting Japanese culture in my earlier books, and I was always encouraged to have a glossary and maybe on the first reference to a word, find a way to explain it subtly.
Because your audience is an American audience. I mean,
yeah.
Right.
And I'm an American woman. I'm half Indian, half German, born in Britain, but I am an American. I emigrated here a long time ago. So I think I come to it from that sensibility. And that can hurt me in some ways, when I'm in terms of when I'm in India, like I probably don't have the greatest street cred.
But because you're an American?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
But I think that's what it is. I think that I just have had that history of of clarifying things, because I don't want anybody to be left behind and turned off.
I'm exactly the same way. When I was writing about Iran or Cuba, or even World War II, I felt the need, both from a personal as well as an audience standpoint, to kind of interpret it, to make sense of it, to show why, why had I brought it up in the first place? That there was a reason, and I sense that that's, I loved it because I just don't know anything about that part of the world. That's a part of the world that so everything that you said, I'm like, oh, wow. And then I would be comparing it. There were a lot of similarities between what the Parsi customs would be and what Orthodox Judaism.
Oh, yes,
A lot of, like, with the menstruation issue, with
the bath, because they have a bath at the end.
Mikvahs. Yep. And the fact that you said the Parsis fulfilled some of the same roles.
That they were like a professional class. They were, a lot of them were lawyers, doctors, accountants, principals of schools, and they were respected by different religions. Like there are some religions in India that historically have suspicion, Hindus and Muslims chiefly, I'm thinking. But there weren't those kinds of complicated relationships with the Parsis. So they were able to get a lot of business. Yeah,
perfect. And there was something else. I think also I could say for me, when I'm writing, I am not just looking to educate an audience, but to show that despite different customs, we're all the same. Human beings are the same, your characters. And that's what I got from your book. I mean, I felt like I could have a cup of tea with Perveen and we would have a great conversation. She was 1920s, but she was very modern too. She was delightful.
She'd enjoy you too.
Thank you. And she wore a nice perfume.
Yeah.
I noticed that you alluded to her clothes and her perfume, and that really, really added something to me.
Yeah, well, the Parsis were well dressed, and they kind of had their own style, and they. Yeah.
So I hope that answers your question. We have one other. Gay Gordons asks, how exciting. Will there be an audio version soon?
It came out yesterday, and I know Gay Gordon's name. She's one of my readers of I have a reader newsletter that comes out. People can go to my website for it, called Asia File, where I give them the latest news. And it is narrated by an Indian American. So I haven't heard it yet. I'm going to download it myself from Audible, but you can also request it from your library.
Perfect. Yeah, so it's on Overdrive.
Yeah.
Great. That's great. Yeah, because audio is huge these days. So we were talking a little bit about your research. Was there anything that you discovered that surprised you?
Yeah, what didn't surprise me? There are certain places that I wanted to go that I couldn't go, and that was frustrating to me. Like, there's some scenes at the docks in Bombay where, because it's this wonderful port, and that's so guarded now because there was this attack in India, the attack on the Taj Hotel and other areas. So I couldn't get into the docks. That kind of thing was a little bit frustrating for me. I'm trying to think what other kind of surprises I had. It was really surprising and wonderful that this old neighborhood that I write about called Fort still exists. And some of the old street names from the British era are there, though most names have been changed to Indian names. And in fact, there's a street called Bruce Street, and that was where I decided to set the law firm. And I had arranged this meetup with an Indian woman lawyer who happened to be a Parsi. She said, I'd love to take you through the fort. And there's a law firm that I used to work at, and I think we can go and visit it. And it's an old building. It's absolutely wonderful. And it was at number 3 Bruce Street, which was exactly the address that I had created for my book for Perveen's family. So I got to go into this building. And so that was like my favorite surprise, was
Right.
that my law firm that I made up actually existed.
Oh, that is funny. It also, it was a very elegant building.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
It's
was,
actually.
it sounded gorgeous.
It's
what am I talking? I just
there
read
is
about it.
on right on the corner. It turns out that there's an industrial family in India called the Tatas, and they are a Parsi family, and they have this fantastic house, which is a mansion. It is a stone mansion, and it's on the edge of that street near the High Court. And I didn't realize it was there, but when I got there, I said, yes, this is exactly where Mystery House would have been. Only the building in my book is older, and it's like a little bit more architecturally interesting.
Tell us about the bakery.
Yazdani's Bakery.
Yeah.
Well, the Parsis are known for wonderful baked foods, and to be specific, the Iranis, who are the later generation, they're the second wave of Parsi immigrants who came in the 19th century. So there are numerous bakeries, Parsi bakeries, in Bombay, in Mumbai still. And Yazdani's actually is in the fort. You can walk into it. A delightful old gentleman will seat you and he'll come over and talk to you. And it's a very special place. And so I decided to name the bakery in my book after that bakery in the hopes that people would go there and get a brun maska cake and a cup of chai when they're in India.
And if you're in India now, you know where to go.
Yeah,
If you're in
you
Bombay.
do. You should read. And I have like where to go in Mumbai on my website,
Oh,
sujatamassey.com, so you can actually visit some
Perfect.
of the places in the
All
book.
right. Well, that's a perfect way to start tying this up because we are running out of time. But this has been fascinating, and I wish we had more time because there's so much more I didn't even get to ask you. But we need to wrap this up. So we've been talking about The Widows of Malabar Hill, Soho Crime by Sujata Massey, and I hope that you will order it. By the way, there was one other thing I definitely need to. The way you balance the plot versus the setting, I thought you did it very gracefully. I mean, there were sentences about the setting, but it didn't. You married the plot and the setting in a very lovely
Thanks.
way.
It's tough
Yeah.
to do those kinds
It
of
is tough.
pacing issues,
Yeah,
as you know.
but it was
so.
very well paced.
Wow, thanks for this opportunity, Libby. I really
my pleasure.
appreciated it.
Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank Soho, and then I want to tell you what's coming up on Authors' Voices, connecting authors to the world. We have Berta's Books on January 18th at 2 p.m. with Elizabeth Berg, whose latest book is The Story of Arthur Truelove. Then we have another Lit with Love, January 24th at 5:30 with Sonali Dev's newest A Distant Heart. Apparently she got 3-starred reviews for that book, so it's worth taking a look at. And by the way, Sujata got 2.5. Wait, you got 3-starred reviews or 2? Yeah, 3.
3.
Huh.
Lucky lady this year.
Wow. Wow. Good book. Okay. And if you need more details, you have any questions at all, just go to authorsvoices.net or the Facebook page. And if you're watching this on YouTube after the broadcast, guess what? You can still order books, and we hope you will. So thank you all for being with us, and we will be back with another edition of Solved.